was on holidays in Adelaide when the Russell Street bomb exploded, and it's fair to say my first response was shock, followed about 30 seconds later by anger, I think it's fair to say. And I heard that a task force had been formed to investigate it, and I rang the task force and asked if I could come and work on it. And they sort of said, when can you start? And I said, as soon as I can drive back from Adelaide. So I come back to Adelaide, so I actually wasn't here when the blast actually went off. And I will say from the outset, it was extremely challenging. It was enormous publicity, nationwide publicity. Melbourne doesn't make international news very often, even to this day, and this incident was publicised overseas, and really all we had was a crime scene, and that consisted of a car wreck, some burnt-out cars, and debris that was scattered between Swanston Street, Lonsdale Street, Victoria Street, and Exhibition Street. So initially, that entire block area was closed down, and we searched the outside part first, through the debris, looking for evidence so that we could reopen the city and get it back to normalcy as soon as possible. We had no leads at the start. We had two suspects. One was a guy named Wilson who had appeared at the Melbourne Magistrates Court on that day on serious criminal charges, and his friend had been, a close friend of his had been shot by the police when they raided a house some months before. He was a suspect for not all that long a period of time, I might say. There was another young criminal, Claudio David Krupi, became a suspect because on the morning of the bombing he was seen manufacturing a bomb in a house out in Broadmeadows, and as it turned out he was actually doing a dummy bomb, and he intended to throw it through the window of the Flemington police station, but it didn't end well for Claudio because his friends all told us about a burglary he did, and that he'd in fact fired shots at the police when they disturbed him at the burglary, and he got 10 years imprisonment for that. So this is how the investigation actually started, and I will say it was we had nothing really to go on, and it was a very, very, very serious job at hand with very little evidence. And I'm going to talk about a particular gentleman, and unbeknownst to me, he's actually seated in the room here today, and his name's he's retired Detective Sergeant ArthurAdams. And what happened was that Arthur actually turned the Russell Street bombing investigation, and it's to his great credit that we actually were put in the right direction for the first time during the investigation. And what happened was that the Russell Street bombing was a culmination of years of criminal activity by a gang who were relatively unknown to police. And they'd been doing armed robberies and serious violent crime, and some of the offences that led up to Russell Street increased in bravado and criminality as they got more and more confident of their behaviour. And there were actually some dreadful armed robberies where women were actually raped. This is the sort of individuals we're talking about here. So what happened was that on the afternoon of the Russell Street bombing, there was an armed robbery on the National Australia Bank in Donvale. And the vehicle used as a getaway vehicle in that armed robbery was a silver Brock Special. It was almost a collector's item vehicle named after Peter Brock. Its registered number was CCH 997. And that vehicle was recovered in the Yarra River a couple of days after the Russell Street bombing, and the investigators that pulled the vehicle out of the river looked at it and they'd seen that some identifying numbers had been tampered with. Now, in Victoria Police, the Stolen Motor Vehicle Squad to this day are the experts in stolen motor vehicles. So the Armed Robbery Squad, of course, were interested in this vehicle and they called upon the Stolen Motor Vehicle Squad to have a look at it to see if they could have any suggestions about who may have actually been involved in the theft of this vehicle. And ArthurAdams and, if my memory serves me correctly, Johnny Bradbury were the two detectives who were requested to go and have a look at this vehicle when it was towed to the police compound over in Footscray. And what happened was the two detectives, Arthur, seated here, and his colleague went out to the Coote Road compound, and the Silver Rock Special hadn't arrived at that stage, and Arthur looked over in the corner and he saw the remnants of the Russell Street bomb car, which had been stored there for evidentiary purposes. And Arthur went over and looked at it, and he was rather surprised because when he looked at the chassis, he saw that the identifying numbers had been drilled out. And that was an unusual modus operandi for car thieves. Normally car thieves, if they rebirth a motor vehicle, they grind the number out and then re-stamp another number into it. And 10 minutes later, the Silver Rock Special arrives at the Coote Road compound, and then Arthur opens up the bonnet, and the first thing he observes is that this vehicle too has its identifying numbers drilled out. And Arthur had been a detective at the Stolen Motor Vehicle Squad for many years, and he virtually came promptly back to the task force office, and I was actually there when he arrived, and he spoke to Darryl Clark, the inspector in charge, and myself. And Arthur, I remember him saying it quite firmly. He said, "Well, I believe the person who stole the bomb car also stole the Silver Rock Special." Now, that was interesting because the Silver Rock Special, the number plates of that vehicle were recovered in the rear of a stolen Red Daimler that had been pursued by the police on the Calder Highway some weeks before the Russell Street bombing. And what had happened was that the offender in that vehicle was pursued by the police. He'd been pulled over, he jumped out of the vehicle, he fired shots, and he stole another vehicle at gunpoint. The investigating police seized that vehicle, and in the rear of that vehicle were the cut-up number plates of the Brock Special, CCH 997. At this stage, it hadn't been used in an armed robbery, but it was a stolen vehicle. So there was also some exhibits located in the rear of that vehicle which were previous court exhibits in the name of a car thief named Stephen Kamiya. Now, the young Highway Patrol officers that pursued that vehicle, they were shown a series of photographs because Stephen Kamiya and his brother Peter Reid were very well-known car thieves, and Peter Reid was probably the most prolific car thief in Melbourne at the time. And the police were shown a group of photographs, and they were certain in their identification that the driver who got out of that vehicle, ran, fired the shots and stole the other vehicle at gunpoint was Peter Reid. Now, when we looked at Peter Reid, further complications. He had prior convictions for car theft. He'd assisted some escapees that had escaped from an interstate prison. But on the morning of the Russell Street bombing, Peter Reid was actually under surveillance by Victoria Police. What had happened was that he'd been nominated to the armed robbery squad as being a person who was doing armed robberies. And also the Stolen Motor Vehicle Squad were very interested in his activities because he was a very prolific car thief. Now, of course, so when we looked at this, and the detectives that were following Peter Reid on the morning of the Russell Street bombing, they said, yeah, he drove into a house at 15 Harros Avenue, Nuttawading, and they kept the street under surveillance. It was a dead-end street, Harros Avenue, so they parked at the end of the street over Springvale Road where they had an eyeball on the entrance to Harros Avenue. But of course what happened was as the bomb went off, their office was actually badly damaged and their senior sergeant told them to give up the surveillance duties for that day and return to the office. So we, as the task force, formed the view that Peter Reid may have supplied the bomb car, but because he was under surveillance, we formed the view that he most probably wasn't involved in the actual bombing. Now, at this stage, we had other suspects that were working very closely on, but one of our teams retained the discipline to work on what they were tasked to do, and that was to follow up the vehicle side of the investigation. And as a consequence of that, a series of raids were conducted on Anzac Day, 25th of April 1986, some month after the Russell Street bombing. The addresses were raided simultaneously, and I'll go through the results of each of those raids individually. The first one was at Alpine Way, Callista, the residence of Peter Reid. The detectives from the task force and the armed robbery squad who raided that address and the Stolen Motor Vehicle Squad detectives, they were met with a hail of gunfire. And one of the detectives who entered the house was actually critically wounded, Detective Sergeant Mark Wiley. Another police officer stepped into the line of fire and returned fire, and Peter Reid was shot. And both Peter Reid and Mark Wiley were taken to hospital in a critical condition. Now, the interesting aspects to Peter Reid's address was, of course, we didn't expect to be confronted by gunfire, because when you looked at his antecedents, that wasn't really what we expected, and we certainly at that stage didn't think he was involved in Russell Street, perhaps as an aider and abettor or an assister, but not as a prime suspect. In his house, we located firearms that had been drilled in a similar way to the motor vehicles. We found gelignite, detonators. We found the gelignite was wrapped in some newspaper, and we found the fingerprints of a petty criminal, Rodney Minogue, on a copy of the Albury Border Morning Mail that was wrapped around the gelignite. And on a toilet door, we found a partial fingerprint, which we identified as being that of Craig William John Minogue. Now, we looked at the Minogue brothers, and they were just eastern suburbs, really petty criminals. Young Rodney had served time in jail for an assault, but really they weren't prominent as far as we were concerned. But the interesting thing with the Minogues was we couldn't find them. They'd vanished into thin air. We traced them to Easter Saturday, and after that no one had seen them. Now, the simultaneous raid was conducted at 15 Harros Avenue, Nuttawading, which was the place that Peter Reid was tailed to on the morning of the bombing. And at that address, we were met by a rather large man waving a shotgun. He was there with his girlfriend, and we found some stolen property from a burglary on Binky's Milk Bar in Brayside. And this young fellow had never been in trouble with the police before, but he grabbed a shotgun when the police raided the house. And he was very fortunate that he wasn't actually shot, because Detective Sergeant in charge of that crew actually fired a shot at him, but it missed. And he later became a very critical part of this investigation. The third address that was raided was Peter Reid's brother Stephen Kamiya, remembering the former court exhibits that had been located in that stolen Red Daimler. And when we visited Mr Kamiyazik's place, he was running to the hallway where there was a loaded shotgun whose identifying numbers had also been drilled out. Now, I went out to that address, and I looked in the garage at the back, and at the time of the Russell Street bombing, the bomb car was owned by a fellow who was a manager of a menswear store at the Brandon Park Shopping Centre. And he told us what was in his vehicle at the time it was stolen, and it consisted of 2 tracksuit tops, a red-handled screwdriver, a Stanley screwdriver set, a PVC chamois. I think there was one other item which doesn't sort of enter my memory at the moment, but these were things that were in the vehicle at the time it was stolen. Now, when we put all the rubble together from Russell Street, our bomb experts were able to tell us that those items were not in the vehicle at the time it was detonated outside Russell Street. So, of course, when we went to these other addresses, we were looking for the stuff that was in the bomb car when it was stolen. And I walked into the garage and I see 2 blue tracksuit tops, I see a PVC chamois, I see a Stanley screwdriver set and a red-handled screwdriver. So I immediately get fairly excited. And we got the owner of that vehicle down, the bomb vehicle, we got him down, and he come straight into the garage and went, "That's mine, that's mine, that's mine." Now, so this is what we're confronted with. We've got Peter Reid in hospital in a critical condition with gunshot wounds. We have one of our own people in a bad way. We have some very interesting exhibits found at Peter Reid's address. We've got 2 young men who have disappeared into thin air, and we have a bike enthusiast waving a shotgun around when we gave him a visit on that same morning. Now, what happened was we worked through over a matter of days what we had, and then we looked again at the tall fellow at 15 Harros Avenue, Karl Zelenka, and he'd been in the Navy, had no prior convictions, and we wondered, how does this guy fit? So he'd been interviewed on the day, said nothing, was released on bail. So myself and one of my colleagues, Gordon Davey, we went and visited him and told him and his girlfriend we'd like to have another conversation with them if they didn't mind, and we took them back to the task force headquarters back at St Kilda Road. And you must, when you're doing this sort of work, you've got to make assessments of human beings. That's one of the great skills of an investigator, I suppose. And both Gordon and I looked at this individual and we formed the view that this guy isn't a criminal. But what's going on here? So we asked him, do you know the Minogues? No, I don't know the Minogues. Do you know Peter Reid? No, I don't know Peter Reid. So what we did was we took photo boards, as we called them, around to all the neighbours, and they said, oh yeah, that big fat fella, he was there all the time, he lived there, and Peter Reid, yeah, he used to visit. So we've got this fellow who's not being at all honest with us. While we were at the house at 15 Harris Avenue, Nuttawading, we looked at the back fence, and we noticed that the fence was relatively new. Now, I'll show you some photographs later, and there was a bomb block of wood in the bomb timing device was set up on, and it had an alarm clock on it. It had a bent over strip of metal, and this block of wood was obviously a relatively new offcut. And we looked at it, and when we looked at the fence, we had a discussion. I didn't think the fence was new enough. My colleague Gordon Davey, a far more astute man than I am, he said, I think that fence is new enough. I think we should check the block of wood against that fence. So about a couple of days later, I went back with the forensic people and we took the bomb block with us that the timing device was on, and we walked along the fence line, and that block of wood sat beautifully on top of a fence post at the rear of the fence line at 15 Harris Avenue, Nuttawading, remembering that was the address that Peter Reid had been followed to on the morning of the bombing, and that was the address that Karl Zelenka, the gun-waving bikie, was living in at the time of the raids on Anzac Day. Now, we went and got Karl Zelenka another day, and we brought him in for another chat, and we got a little bit more from him, but he still denied knowing the people of interest. So we went and got him a third day, and we brought him in and sat him and his girlfriend down, and we confronted him with the facts. And the facts were, the neighbours all said these guys all lived there with you. You know, I think it's about time you told the truth, because that block of wood that you used to rest your motorcycle stand on was used in the Russell Street bombing, and we think you're involved in this up to your teeth. And Karl actually was he was a decent fellow, and he said, if you can guarantee the safety of my family and my girlfriend and I'll tell you what happened. And we then spent 2 or 3 days getting a statement from him and his girlfriend. And what had happened was that he'd befriended the Minogues. They were all living together. Just before the Russell Street bombing, he saw a stack of gelignite in the shed, and he asked Craig Minogue to move it. He saw the bomb car in the backyard a couple of days before the bombing. Craig Minogue paid Karl Zelenka and his girlfriend Karen to go on a holiday to Sydney over Easter. So he was actually out of Melbourne at the time of the bombing, and he told us, and it was quite believable, he said, I was lying in the motel room, the news come on, the Russell Street bombing come on, and he said, I saw this burning wheel. And he said, I looked at it, this mag wheel on this wreck of the bomb car, and he said, that's the vehicle that was in the backyard. And he just formed this view in his mind that this is why I got a paid holiday to Sydney for the weekend for over Easter. And he was terrified for his life, Karl Zelenka, I will say. He was absolutely terrified. He got back from Sydney, and they were all clearing the house out, and he actually, they told him to get rid of certain things, and one of them was a willow rubbish bin that he owned, and they said, we want you to throw that down the tip. And Karl didn't, he kept it, and he actually took it round to his girlfriend's mother's place and retained it there. So this was pretty critical for us, but Karl also spoke about an old criminal, an old fellow who used to visit Reid and the Minogues, and he called him Stan the Man. And he said, look, he was in his 50s. I used to call him Stan the Man, and he lived up the country somewhere. Now, I had a very astute detective on my crew, a guy named Mark Harris, and I sent him down to our criminal records section. Remember, this is pre-computer days. This is when our records were on card systems. And Mark went down to the records section. He was down there buried in the archives for about 2 days. and he come out covered in dust and grinning, and what he'd done is he'd found Stan the Man, a Stanley Brian Taylor, whose driver's licence was registered to the Minogue's address at 10 Neville Street in Mirrabooka, where Mr. and Mrs. Minogue, the parents of Rodney and Craig Minogue, lived. So he formed a pretty good view that yes, he was the man, Stan the Man. We looked at him, and he was an absolutely notorious criminal. He'd spent his entire adult life in prison. He'd been released. There was actually a current affairs program interviewed him. He was released and sought a job as a youth worker. And from this work, he met the Minogues, and he actually recruited them into his criminal activities, and actually put them on the road to crime. Now, Rodney Minogue had served time with Peter Reid. They'd shared a cell together in a country prison, and that was how the relationships were all formed. They started off doing burglaries, and then it just progressed to really, really, really serious armed robberies. And like they did the ANZ Bank at Templestowe, I think they got $120,000 there. When you think back to the early 80s, it was a lot of money. They did some enormously successful armed robberies on payroll trucks. They were a very, very violent and active criminal gang. Yep. So what happened with all that, of course, was the investigation progressed. We got to find the Minogues, and eventually we visited Mr. and Mrs. Minogue, and Mrs. Minogue reluctantly, digit by digit, gave us the phone number where the boys were living. And they told us, she told us that they were living in Birchip, and that Stan Taylor was living in Birchip also. So we arranged to raid these two premises up in Birchip, and the Minogues weren't there. Stan Taylor was arrested. He immediately threw his arms in the air and told us that the two Minogues and Peter Reid did the Russell Street bombing. He had nothing to do with it. And the boys had been involved in a scuffle at a pub in Birchip, and they were at the Jane Eliza Motel in Swan Hill. So we put the Special Operations Group in a helicopter, flew them to Swan Hill, and the two Minogue brothers were arrested in a motel room, both armed, with fully loaded firearms on the floor next to them. It was very interesting because amongst the debris at Russell Street was a socket set that had been put in to provide, shrapnel to make the bomb more effective. And we'd found just about a complete socket set at Russell Street, and we found the rest of it in Craig Minogue's storage shed at Albury. So there was all these. The scientific evidence became pretty overwhelming. Craig Minogue sat there during the interview, and he didn't even blink. He told us his name and address and just sat there and stared at us. Rodney Minogue actually made a statement implicating his brother Peter Reid and Stan Taylor as being the bombers, and they went to trial, and the end result was Stanley Brian Taylor was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, never to be released. Craig Minogue was sentenced to 40 years with a minimum of 28. Young Rodney Minogue was sentenced to 10 years for accessory after the fact to the Russell Street bombing, but was acquitted on appeal to the High Court by the High Court of Australia. And Peter Reid mysteriously was acquitted of the Russell Street bombing, but was convicted of attempted murder on the two detectives who actually raided his house, and of course one of them he actually shot, Mark Wiley. So I've given you there an investigation that raged for months. I've given you about a 15-minute synopsis of it, but that was the investigation side in a nutshell. And again, the man who turned the investigation, ArthurAdams, I haven't seen him for about 25 years. He's sitting here with us. Put your hand up, Arthur. Well done. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bernie. So now we hand over to Geoff Wilkinson, who's going to take you through his involvement in the Russell Street story.
Thanks, Seamus. My job at the time of the bombing was as media director for the Victoria Police, and it was my job in the context of the bombing to make sure it remained front of mind with the public for as long as possible, and that they provided as much information to the investigators as possible. And I probably had three things in my favour that day. The first is that there wasn't as many police reporters in the area as usual, because it was what was known in the trade, the morning newspaper trade anyway, as Good Thursday. And what happened on Good Thursday every year was a cricket match between the reporters and the sub-editors. And a grudge match, as you can imagine. And so most of the morning newspaper police reporters were down in South Yarra playing cricket when the bomb went off. And we heard earlier the many things that have changed since then. Another thing that wasn't around in those days was mobile phones. And I was talking to one of those cricketing police reporters yesterday, and he said, well, we heard the bomb, or we heard the explosion, but nobody knew what it was, and we had no immediate way of finding out, so they played on. It was, in fact, 3/4 of an hour later that somebody made a phone call from a phone box to a mate about something or other and was told what had happened. And that's when the game was largely abandoned, I think, and the police reporters headed north to Russell Street. One of them, the bloke I was talking to yesterday, Jimmy Tennyson, was chief police reporter at The Sun at the time, and that's another thing that's changed. The Sun in those days was probably selling about 570,000 copies and had a readership of over 1.5 million, which became important in the context of the bombing, and I'll mention that in a minute. But Jimmy, still clad in his whites, rushed into town and tried to get to the Russell Street bombing scene. And he said when he got to Exhibition Street, after battling heavy traffic caused by all the traffic diversions, he was confronted by a soldier. And that was another thing that was different about this investigation. The military were involved from day one in terms of providing expertise about explosives and other matters. And when Jimmy tried to get past the roadblock, to get to the scene, and tried desperately to explain to this soldier that he was in fact a chief police reporter on his way to a major job. The soldier just looked him up and down in his whites and said, yeah, sure you are, yeah. So, and the other thing that was mildly amusing out of that later on was that the Sun News Pictorial had recently moved down to offices in Russell Street above a bike shop about 50 yards down the road from where the bomb went off, and the previous week they'd had some windows in that office repaired to fix the damage from indoor cricket. And sadly a week later the glass blew out again when the bomb went off. The second thing was in my favour was that although they weren't there, I was. I'd been out at a training exercise out in the northern suburbs with a policewoman called Sergeant Glennis Russell, who was working at the Media Liaison Bureau at that time. And we were returning to Russell Street to her office, and her office door opened onto the footpath in Russell Street, about 20 or 30 metres from the bomb. At precisely 1 o'clock, thankfully, I got a red light at the bottom of Lygon Street outside the Trades Hall, and that's where we were sitting in the car when the bomb went off. I thought I'd been rammed up the backside by a truck, the way the car shook and jolted. And there's a slight dogleg there, I don't know whether you know it, and we couldn't see the car, but we could certainly see the pall of black smoke and all the wreckage flying through the air. So at least I was Johnny on the spot, and it's not often you get to a breaking news story before the media, then or now. But Glennis Russell was certainly was her lucky day, I think, because if we'd got a green light up the road outside the Trades Hall, we would have either been approaching her office or she could have in fact been walking across the footpath to her office door when the bomb went off. The third thing in my favour was that I'd spent 5 years or so at that stage as police media director, and before that I'd been 5 or 6 years as chief police reporter for The Sun, and I knew most of the detectives who were assigned during the course of the afternoon and the next day to join the task force, including Bernie. And I worked with and was on good terms with the higher-ups, the Chief Commissioner Mick Miller and Paul Delanus, the Crime Commissioner, and Keith Thompson, the Deputy Commissioner, who were all critically involved. And it was that sort of level of trust and mutual respect that came in pretty handy over the course of the next few weeks. My first inclination after the explosion was to drive my car straight down the road, which I did, and left it outside the IWF building so I could get on with doing my job, which I saw as collecting facts and information and whatever. Glennis Russell, on the other hand, being a copper, she saw her job as grabbing hold of the few media who were there in the initial stages and keeping them as far as possible from the scene. But we compromised, and there was some journalists, camera crews on the scene very quickly, because Channel 10 had a city office just around the corner in Mackenzie Street, and the Herald, who were working because they did have a paper to fill that day, they had some reporters in Russell Street in their room, which was next door virtually to the Media Liaison Bureau. So they too were Johnny on the spot. Driving my car down the road to where I left it didn't turn out to be such a bright idea after all, actually, because as the crime scene expanded for blocks, my car became well and truly stuck in the crime scene, and it was 5 days before I could access it again. My second inclination, as I said, was to start gathering information, like any reporter worth his salt, but I found myself wondering the other day just how different it would have been these days, 30 years later, when every man and his dog's a citizen reporter and everybody's got a camera phone and would have been shooting pictures and video and whatever, which could have come in pretty handy from an evidentiary point of view, but could have also made things very difficult to control on the day. The first media conference that day took place around the corner in La Trobe Street outside the police auditorium, and we'd arranged for a pool camera crew and a pool photographer to go inside the building under supervision and record the level of devastation inside the building, which was enormous. And by the time the news went to air that night, we had a pretty good idea of the exact numbers of injured and what their condition was and who they were, and various other basic facts. As I said, from then on, my job was to work with the task force and the media to ensure maximum coverage of the investigation. And you've already heard how good the forensic investigation was, and it really was quite extraordinary, the evidence that was put together and all the pieces of the puzzle that fitted together. It was also, in my memory, probably the best example of effective cooperative police media liaison I know of before or since. And that had a lot to do, I think, with the people running the force at the time and the respect the media had for them. Day two, there was a press conference with Mick Miller and Race Matthews, the then police minister, and they too had a very good relationship and still do. There was a $100,000 award announced initially, which was later increased to $500,000 to cater for a fellow who rang the Chief Commissioner and claimed to have knowledge and video, I think, of pictures that could solve the bombing. And he didn't get the money, but he got the box later on when he was captured in a phone box in St Kilda making a phone call to the Chief Commissioner. But I think the bombing was on the front page of the papers for every day for a fortnight. And as Bernie said, it was national and international news. One of our earliest, and we made sure that if we didn't have a particularly strong angle to that the words weren't earth-shattering, the pictures were, and there was lots of good picture opportunities during the course of it. One of our earliest coups was to do a deal with the Herald Weekly Times, who agreed to publish a colour glossy front page featuring the car and the blanket that was wrapped around the bomb, which it was hoped would yield vital evidence. And in those days, Herald Reviewer printers in Hawthorn printed colour. There was no such thing as colour in the paper routinely. And it took, I think, 2 days to get this front page done. And they also printed lots of poster versions of it to go in newsagents and police stations all over the state. And of course, the colour wraparound had to be paid for, and in fact, I was reminded the other day that it was Dunhill Cigarettes that picked up the sponsorship. Bless their hearts. One of my sadder tasks over the time was to protect the best interests of Angela Taylor's parents, Marilyn and Arthur, who were at this function we were at earlier in the day today, and are very impressive people. And I said to Marilyn today, you didn't have much experience dealing with the media or public speaking in those days 30 years ago, but you're a star at it now. And said that that's how she became accomplished. And that sort of involvement with the family included, media conferences and the funeral and various other things. But on a positive note, also during the formation of the Angela Taylor Memorial Trust, which came out of her death and is still going in the form of the Blue Ribbon Foundation, which was formed as an amalgamated with the trust after the death of Tynan Eyre a couple of years later. And the trust I mentioned, the cooperation extended right up to the time of the arrests. When they went to Birchip to round up Stan Taylor, they took me with them. And when they went to Swan Hill after that to round up the Minogues at the Jane Eliza Motel, I was with them there as well. And the end result was, by about 7 o'clock in the morning, there was a nice, clean 20-paragraph fact-filled press release sitting at Media Liaison and sitting on every news media desk in Melbourne, and so everybody was happy. And that was one of the joys and positive things of that experience and that investigation, was that there was no leaks out of it. Claudio Krupi, when he became a very good, strong suspect very early in the piece, I was with them the Sunday afternoon. They raided his parents' house in the northern suburbs, and Claudio wasn't there, but sadly his parents' little white fluffy dog was, and it wasn't too thrilled when the SOG came smashing through the door of the house, and the dog got such a fright that he soiled himself on the white shag pile in the lounge room. So I don't know why I remember those sort of things. Yeah. Max Williams, the superintendent in charge of the task force, or overseeing the task force, reminded me yesterday that some of the public information that was received in the course of the investigation related to matters other than the task force and the bombing, and in fact they arrested 18 people for 52 offences, up to and including attempted murder, as a consequence of public calls, which of course was a bonus. These days, of course, those calls would have come through Crime Stoppers, and ironically, Crime Stoppers' introduction was probably delayed by the bombing and a few other major events around that time, because I'd been too busy or too slack to write up my report following my Churchill Fellowship study tour, where I pinched the idea from the Yanks. But so eventually it was 1987 by the time I wrote the report, and it was accepted, and away we went. which I've made some other reference to something else. Oh, that's right. On that study tour, I'd spent a couple of weeks in Northern Ireland, and there's still a few bombs going off there in the mid-80s, and I recalled later that everybody who'd ever been to Northern Ireland and heard about these come-along bombs where the villains would set an explosion and people would flock, the emergency services would flock to do their business and deal with it, and then the second bomb would go off and kill them all. And nobody running around Russell Street like headless chooks after this explosion was thinking of the come-along factor. Sadly, there was only one bomb. I think my time has expired, and I'm happy to, I'm sure there's bits I've missed, but I'm happy to deal with any questions we might be able to answer later on. Thanks.
I'm going to talk about the Russell Street bombing exhibition that the National Trust has just opened today. We've launched it at the Old Melbourne Jail, and it's something we've done in partnership with the Victorian Police Museum. And you're probably wondering, why on earth is the National Trust getting involved in something like this? Well, we run the Old Melbourne Jail Crime and Justice Experience, and so we are interested in crime and justice and in introducing the public to issues in that area. And we look at the dark side of history as well. We have acknowledged the sites where Tunnerminnerwait and Malboyheenner were hung, and the story of Ned Kelly, and also of the 135 criminals that were hung at the jail. And it's our interest to bring people into an understanding of the full picture of Melbourne's history, both good and bad. So I just thought I'd talk briefly a little bit about the exhibit. It's not a large exhibit. My wife told me, for goodness sake, don't say it's an exhibition. It is a small, modest exhibit. But I think it was important for us because we run the site that is exactly across the road from where the bomb site. We felt very important and responsible that we had to do something to acknowledge and mark this moment in Melbourne's history. So part of the exhibit includes, and it's interesting that, because the police use the word exhibits, so we have, these are the objects we've borrowed from the Victoria Police Museum, and these are the wood blocks that Bernie mentioned earlier from Carl Zelenka's backyard. It's interesting, there's a tiny piece of chucks on one of the blocks. That was actually used, I believe, Bernie, as insulation to prevent the bomb going off while the bombers drove the vehicle with the bomb through the streets of Melbourne. So you can imagine, it's a obviously very crude and obscure sort of object. This is a picture from one of the evidence books on display, and that's Carl Zelenka's fence. And you can see that it's these banal, simple things, but the police put together from the few clues with such great observance to connect to a new fence being built, to make that connection at one of the many properties that they investigated. Some of the other exhibits are, that's a segment of a bin lid, and there's some of the detonator wires. Again, as part of the exhibit, we have some photographs from the bomb site, and when you see the enormous amount of material and debris across the site, and then you realise that the police sifted through all of that and found these items and put them together and then worked out how everything came together. It's a remarkable piece of investigative work. That's the shattered number plate from the Commodore. In fact, we've given our visitors the challenge of repiecing it together as part of the experience at the exhibit. We're showing the exhibit is in one of the cells at the City Watch House. It's a large group cell, and I suppose in some ways it seems appropriate because the cell has got bags of atmosphere, shall we say, and it certainly has a sense of impending doom about it and a sense of seriousness rather than if it was just shown in maybe a white wall gallery. I'm just going to talk briefly about the Russell Street itself. The former head quarters of Russell Street Police Headquarters. When you walk past them now, they're actually an apartment block. There's very little for most Melburnians to nowadays to connect it to being the original police headquarters. I guess the cafe is called Blue Point, but that's about the only acknowledgement you'll get there. But I think for many Melburnians, they will always connect this building with Russell Street Police. When it was designed and built in 1943 by Percy Everett, it was sort of reconstructing the Empire State Building, and it was creating that 1920s New York skyline. And it's a very handsome building with its soaring radio mast. And I guess as for me, that sense of it, that building has always been an icon of the police. And I guess in some respects, that's perhaps why the bombers identified the building as a place to make an attack on the police directly. I don't think they were architectural enthusiasts, however. This also housed, although it was at the time of the bombing, it was not police headquarters, which had moved to William Street, and I'm told by Seamus they've now moved to the Remand Centre, police headquarters. It was where D24, the major police communications were housed. And these are some shots we've got from the ABC. We have some film footage from the time. And the bomb was designed to go off at lunch recess to cause maximum impact on the police and bystanders. It was the recess for the courts, across the Magistrates' Court across the road. And there were quite a number of people in the street at the time. 21 people were injured by the bomb. And the bomb killed Constable Angela Taylor, who was the first female police officer murdered in her duty. It also seriously injured Officer Carl Donadio and Magistrate Ian West. I think with the recent events in Paris and Brussels, we're sort of getting familiar with these sorts of images. And it is, I guess, the random nature of this attack and the brutal slaying of people who were just in the wrong place by happen chance, who had no connection whatsoever, who were just randomly selected. I guess this is the true horror of this incident. D24 Communications was located on the first floor, and it was right opposite where the car exploded. And I guess it took the full brunt of the explosion. It was only heavy curtains on the windows that prevented many of the officers from being seriously injured by the flying glass. In the exhibition, we've got the soundtrack from the recording of D24 Communications over 5 minutes during the event, and it's astonishing the composure of the officers who were fully cognizant that after the first explosion, there was likely to be a second one, which there was 2 minutes later. So it's extraordinary to hear officers running operations aware that at any moment there will be another explosion, which there was. One object we don't have is the original car, which is on display at the Victoria Police Museum. And Catherine Spinks at the museum was telling me how much this object affects visitors, because it sort of graphically shows, almost like as an icon, the immense force of the bomb, because the car is completely compacted. And it sort of graphically illustrates the destructive capability and force of the bomb. It gives people a sense of the scale of the crime. And she said it's an important object, an artifact for public display. I guess part of the story we do want to focus on is the investigation. And the objects on display are really objects that you would never normally display in a museum. They've never before been shown to the public because they're actually the evidence used in the case They were discovered as part of the investigation. They're very crude objects. They're very sort of banal and insignificant objects in their own right. It's just that they have this manifest power because of the significance of them and the story behind them. I guess if there's one positive to take out of this story is the extraordinary police work that was done, the remarkable amount of material the police had to go through over many city blocks to sort through and sift through to find tiny, tiny pieces of metal that they were able to piece together from all the evidence to work out who the bombers were. I think I spoke to Bernie earlier and he gave me a very important clue, and he said at any bomb site, the actual evidence of the bombers is at the bomb site. It's just been exploded, and that's part of the something I hadn't considered, that police, were aware that the actual evidence is right there at the site. It's just that they have to work out how on earth to find it. The other part of a museum are your visitors. And unusually at the Old Melbourne Jail, we get visitors who don't often go to museums necessarily. So it's important for us to make sure that they engage with this story. And I guess we as museum professionals, we sort of wrestle with how to present a story like this. We don't want to sensationalise the case, make a sideshow of it, but we think it is important that people do emotionally have an emotional reaction to the story, and that they also get a better understanding of it. Our visitors may also have a connection. In putting this exhibit together, so many people have said to me, I remember where I was on the day. But there's also the other, on the other side of the coin, I've mentioned to younger people, and they've said to me, oh, was there a bomb that went off in Melbourne? I didn't realise. So I think that's what will be important out of this exhibit, is to just remind Melburnians of this major event. So that's when you walk down Russell Street today. You can stop at the Blue Point Cafe, enjoy a cappuccino, and maybe if you look up, you can see the scars of where our city was bruised. I'd like to thank Catherine Spinks and the Victoria Police Museum for all their help and partnership in putting on our exhibit. The exhibit is open. It's at the City Watch House. And if you ask very nicely, and if you only want to see the exhibit, you can ask very nicely at the gatehouse, but otherwise it's part of your Watch House experience. Thank you.